Good afternoon, everyone. Well, welcome, and thanks for coming. Welcome to our public speech by Dr. James Lee, co-sponsored by 21st Century China Center, UC Institute of Global Conflict and Cooperation, and also by the Center for Taiwan Studies at UCSD. My name is Ping Wei Liao. I'm now the founding director of Taiwan Studies Center at UCSD. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. James Lee. But before that, my responsibility is to introduce the three sponsors. The first one, 21st Century China Center, is a renowned research center and think tank based at UCSD School of Global Policy and Strategy. The center's primary focus is on conducting cutting-edge research, engaging with businesses and policymakers, and fostering educational exchange. With a long and strong foundation in research and a prominent presence in policy decisions beyond academia, the center plays a critical role in promoting informed dialogue and shaping the relationship between the United States and China. Our second co-sponsor, the UC Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation, is a UC system-wide research network that conducts policy-relevant research to mitigate conflict and promote a more peaceful world order with a portfolio that includes both traditional security issues and emerging and non-traditional challenges. We are now having all kinds of problems because of Ukraine. And also, I think Sunday we have two major elections in Turkey and in Thailand. That will be very much in a way that we need not only 21st Century China Center and Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation, but we are now joining on all kinds of exciting projects in Taiwan Studies Center. Lots of ways that we conduct presidential polls or mayor polls on how people think about how China will be, because of all kinds of aggression recently, will be changing the relationship between Taiwan, China, and US. And this is very much in the way that we hope that we can actually extend our polls all the way to 2024, because that will be major presidential elections in Taiwan and also in US. They will be in all kinds of ways consequential, because right now democracy is on a coma. We hope the Sunday elections in Thailand and in Turkey probably will wake democracy up. So this is the major mission in our institute. Lots of places at our on campus, not only 21st Century China Center or Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation. Taiwan Study actually right now, in collaboration with all kinds of institutes across disciplines. We have lots of steering committee members from bioengineering and Jacob School. So it's very much across borders and disciplines in the way that I would like to ask the world to pay attention to Taiwanese and Taiwanese American voices. That's the major mission for the Center for Taiwan Studies at UCSD. And now I introduce my good friend, Dr. James Lee. I'm sure you all know him very well. He needs no introduction. Dr. James Lee is an assistant research fellow at the Institute of European and American Studies at Academica Sinica in Taiwan, and also affiliated researcher at IGCC. His research has been published in all kinds of journals. The list is very long. I don't want to mention all of them. That would take us to midnight. So he got his PhD in politics from Princeton University in 2018. And since then, had held important teaching or research positions at the European University Institute in Florence, and also GPS at UCSD. And in the coming fall, he will be an Eisenhower Fellow at the NATO Defense College in Rome. So let's welcome Dr. Jensen.
Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Thanks so much for coming, and thank you to Taiwan CCC, IBCC, and the Center for Taiwan Studies for sponsoring the event. So today I'm going to be presenting on the current debate about threats and assurances in U.S.-China tensions surrounding Taiwan, and particularly focusing on how the kind of theory of threats and assurances is related to the United States' historic one China policy. So what I'm going to do is start with a description of kind of current tensions and current debates, and walk us back to the beginning of this dispute and how a lot of the issues we're dealing with today are rooted in history and in a lack of an agreement between the United States and China in the dispute over Taiwan in the 1970s. So it's going to take a pretty deep dive into the communiques and other very technical language of U.S.-China-Taiwan relations. So there will be Q&A at the end, but if anything doesn't make sense as I'm presenting, please let me know, because some of this can get really legalistic and pretty intensive on jargon. So there's been a great deal of concern about the risk of conflict in the Taiwan Strait. And the cause for this is that the PRC has raised its coercive campaign against Taiwan ever since Taiwan's government stopped recognizing the one China principle, which is the position that Taiwan and the mainland are both part of one China. Starting in 2016, Taiwan's government stopped recognizing that position, and Beijing has ramped up its coercive activities against Taiwan. There are routine incursions and violations in Taiwan's air defense and identification zone. Beijing has held military exercises around the Taiwan Strait, and this has given rise to a great deal of concern that Beijing may be preparing to use force against Taiwan, possibly in 2027, maybe 2025. So there is a great deal of alarm about the possibility of a great power conflict erupting in the Taiwan Strait in the near future. And estimates of the impact of such a conflict vary, but roughly speaking, we're looking at a military conflict between the world's two nuclear-armed superpowers, and in economic terms, it would cause damage to on the order of about $500 billion to the world economy. And it might take decades before the United States would be able to recover from the damage to Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing capacity, which is based on Taiwan. So there's been a great deal of concern about the risk of war in the Taiwan Strait. And in this process, the focus has been on Beijing's coercive campaign against Taiwan and Beijing's aggression. But there have also been concerns about how the United States may be aggravating tensions, because the United States has been supporting Taiwan in the context of a larger great power competition with Beijing. And there's alarm that the U.S. may be supporting Taiwan too much in certain ways, potentially aggravating tensions instead of deterring Beijing. And so one group of scholars who have contributed to the task force on U.S.-China relations sponsored by 21 CCC have summarized this view by saying that the growing rhetoric in Washington to support Taiwan's permanent separation from mainland China or restore something akin to an alliance relationship with the island increases fears in Beijing that waiting for a peaceful resolution of cross-strait differences will only result in a permanent loss of Taiwan. And in this context, they focus on how deterrence involves both threats to use military force and also the assurance that refraining from using force will not lead the other party to suffer an unacceptable loss according to its preferences. So in making recommendations for U.S. strategy, Thomas Christensen and his co-authors focus on deterrence as involving both threats and assurance. So they say deterrence requires credibility in both of its elements, threat and assurance. The threat requires signaling both the costs for prescribed action and sufficient political will to impose those costs. The assurance requires conveying to the target in a way that it can trust that it will not be taken advantage of if it refrains from taking the prescribed action. So the question becomes, how can the United States balance threats and assurances to deter Beijing? What do those terms even mean? So if you look at this kind of description of threats and assurance in deterrence and deterrence strategy, it makes sense and it's clear enough at a theoretical level. But what does it mean at a practical level? What kinds of assurances does the United States need to provide to Beijing in order to deter Beijing from using military force? One possibility, just taking a very simplistic view of the world, would be the US sits down with China and says, what kind of assurances does China want in order to prevent conflict? But then in that case, if the US just asks China what it wants, China then has an incentive to exaggerate it, because China's ultimate preference is to constrain the US and Taiwan very tightly. So China will go beyond the minimum degree of assurance necessary to not use force, and will push the US and Taiwan into a corner. And so the one practical way to kind of visualize this is that China often warns the United States and Taiwan about crossing its so-called red line. And so the way Chinese rhetoric portrays the situation, the United States current support for Taiwan, if it pushes further in a certain direction, will cross this red line, and they constantly warn about the imminent proximity of this red line. So if the US asks China what kind of assurances it's asking for, China might then just push the red line very close to the current degree of US support. But in reality, it could be the case that the real red line is actually very far from what we're seeing right now in the Taiwan Strait, and that Beijing is exaggerating and bluffing in order to constrain the United States and Taiwan. So it's not feasible or desirable for the United States to simply ask China what it wants. So then the question becomes, how can the United States balance threats and assurances? How do we go from this very theoretical concept down to the level of practical implementation of policy? I mean, the whole issue of how to reassure Beijing can be seen in a lot of details of US policy. For example, there are guidelines in the State Department on how to represent Taiwan on the map, down to the level of which font you use to represent Taiwan. It gets down to a very microscopic level of detail. And the answer to that, how do you represent Taiwan on the map, is you must, according to the State Department, in the government map, the United States must use a font for Taiwan that is different from a font for a province of China, and also different from the font of a sovereign state. That is laid down by the Office of the Geographer. So the United States has a policy that has kept the peace in the Taiwan Strait for almost half a century. And its threats and assurances to Beijing are encoded in three key terms. Beijing's pursuit of a, quote, peaceful approach to the dispute over Taiwan, the United States, quote, unofficial relations with Taiwan, and the United States' opposition to unilateral changes in the, quote, status quo. And some of these threats and assurances are conditional on Beijing's actions, but others are not. And part of the reason why we've seen spiraling tensions is that the US hasn't always observed the distinction between conditional and unconditional assurances to Beijing. So look at the term peaceful. There are conditional assurances in the One China policy regarding the term peaceful. If Beijing adopts a peaceful approach to the dispute over Taiwan, the United States will not become directly involved in Taiwan's defense, such as through an alliance. If Beijing reduces its threat against Taiwan, the United States will reduce its arms sale to Taiwan. So these kinds of assurances are all conditional on a certain set of actions by Beijing. And there are also conditional threats. If Beijing adopts a non-peaceful approach to the dispute over Taiwan, the United States could become directly involved in Taiwan's defense. And if Beijing does not reduce its threat against Taiwan, the United States will not reduce its arms sales to Taiwan. So there's a lot of if-then, there's a lot of conditionality in surrounding the term peaceful. But there are also unconditional assurances. One unconditional assurance is that the United States will not have official diplomatic relations with Taiwan. So right now, there's a kind of general atmosphere in Washington saying China hasn't kept up its end of the bargain. We don't have to keep up our end of the bargain either. But that belies the fact that in the United States One China policy, a lot of these assurances were not defined in a conditional way. The US never said that whether or not the US has official or unofficial relations with Taiwan is conditional on China keeping up with the bargain. Another term that is unconditional is the status quo. The United States opposes unilateral changes to the status quo. There's an unconditional threat in that the United States opposes a unilateral attempt by Beijing to unify with Taiwan through force or coercion. And there's unconditional assurance is that the United States does not support Taiwan's independence. So the US never said that whether the US supports Taiwan's independence is conditional on Beijing fulfilling a certain set of conditions. So part of the reason why there's been growing tensions is that as Beijing has not met the US conditions, the US has started to adopt language that seems to suggest support for Taiwan's independence. So to kind of rehearse the events that have happened recently. So Beijing has not fulfilled the United States conditions, and there's been ongoing coercion and gray zone warfare against Taiwan and possible preparation for war. In response, the United States has exercised its conditional threats by continuing arms sales to Taiwan and maintained the capacity to directly intervene in Taiwan's defense through a military buildup in the Pacific. But the United States also has not consistently adhered to unconditional assurances, treating them as if they were conditional, not having official diplomatic relations with Taiwan, not supporting unilateral changes to the status quo by Taiwan. And this has been perceived in Beijing as a gradual move toward US support for Taiwan's independence, and then Beijing ratchets up its threat in response to these actions. And so we have a situation of spiral tensions. So here are some examples. Are US relations with Taiwan still unofficial? A sitting US ambassador, John Hennessy Niall, he was the ambassador to Palau, visited Taiwan with the Palau delegation. That was the first time a sitting US ambassador had visited Taiwan since the severing of diplomatic relations in 1979. There have been loosening restrictions on contacts between US and Taiwanese officials. Nancy Pelosi visiting Taiwan and Kevin McCarthy meeting with Taiwan, the president of Taiwan in the United States. All these actions were interpreted by some as a departure from the unofficial character of US-Taiwan relations. Other people said that these are in keeping with the unofficial character of US-Taiwan relations. So these actions are controversial. Does the United States still oppose unilateral changes to the status quo? In 2019, the Department of Defense referred to Taiwan as a democracy. Mike Pompeo said in a radio interview in November 2020, Taiwan has not been a part of China. Antony Blinken has said Taiwan is a country on 2 occasions. Biden has called Taiwan independent. And most recently, Biden has said, quote, Taiwan makes their own judgments about their independence. That's their decision. So that seems like the United States is pushing on the issue of sovereignty. And it seems like the US is starting to adopt a policy more like a one China, one Taiwan policy. Is that a violation of the bargain? Is the United States not fulfilling its end of the bargain? It's very difficult to say. And this is the root of the problem right now, that there is no agreement between Washington and Beijing about what the 3 key terms mean. It's understood that they define the term peaceful differently. For the United States, peace is the absence of both force and coercion. For Beijing, peace is the absence of force, not necessarily coercion. So when you read about all these Chinese warplanes circling Taiwan, Chinese military exercises around Taiwan, Beijing tries to portray that as still being part of a policy of peaceful unification. It doesn't look that way to the United States or the United States allies, but Beijing insists that this is still peaceful because they include coercion as part of peace. And that's unacceptable for the United States and US allies in the Pacific. But in the case of the term peaceful, it's known that there's a disagreement on what this term means. Unofficial, that term has never been defined at a theoretical level. And the US reserves an exclusive right to interpret it at a practical level through what are called the contact guidelines. So when Taiwanese officials come to the United States, can they meet US officials in their government offices? That's changed over time. And sometimes in the past, it was much more restrictive. The restrictions have loosened up a great deal recently. And Beijing complains about this and calls it a violation of unofficial US-Taiwan relations. But the term unofficial has never been formally defined, much less agreed upon by both sides. Status quo. Washington has never defined all the features of the status quo at a conceptual level. Maintaining the status quo doesn't mean nothing changes, because US policy and Chinese policy toward Taiwan has changed throughout the last 50 years. But the status quo supposedly has not changed. But the US has never defined the status quo. Beijing considers the one China principle to be part of the status quo, which the United States does not agree with. But beyond that, it's not really clear what this term status quo means, and the United States has resisted attempts to define it formally. So to see how each of these terms factors into the United States policy toward Taiwan, this is a summary of the basic content of the US position. The United States is neutral on the substance of Taiwan's political status. The United States considers Taiwan's status to be undetermined and maintains unofficial relations with Taiwan. The United States does not support or oppose future unification or independence. So the content is something on which the United States takes no position, the content of sovereignty. Where the United States is not neutral is on the process for determining Taiwan's political status. The United States opposes unilateral changes to the status quo, including the use of non-peaceful means by the PRC and a unilateral declaration of independence by Taiwan. And to deter the PRC from using non-peaceful means, the United States has a policy of maintaining the capacity, but not the obligation, to intervene in Taiwan's defense and of selling arms to Taiwan. So the basic summary of US policy is neutrality of substance of sovereignty, but not neutrality of process. The US is focusing on the rules by which any determination of sovereignty is achieved, and the United States insists that Taiwan's sovereignty cannot be determined through force or coercion. This policy is expressed in 3 different levels. There's a fundamental position in which the United States only recognizes one Chinese government, which is the government of the PRC, and the US has unofficial relations with Taiwan. That's the basic idea. The US has never changed this since 1979. This position has been elaborated through doctrinal statements, which are also an unchanging fixed elements, including the US PRC joint communiques and the US unilateral statements of policy in the Taiwan Relations Act and the 6 assurances. The part that does change are the diplomatic practices. How do you turn the Shanghai Communique and the Taiwan Relations Act into a concrete policy for governing how the United States interacts with Taiwan? You have a fixed element at 10,000 feet in the air, and then you have all these variable elements like where can US officials meet Taiwanese officials? How do you represent Taiwan on a map? Which hotel did Nancy Pelosi stay at when she visits Taiwan? It was not at a state hotel, it was at a private hotel. There are all these kinds of nuances and very subtle distinctions in how the United States goes about interpreting these very high-level statements of policy into the concrete actions of US-Taiwan relations. So to summarize, the US One China policy overlaps with Beijing's position to some degree. This is where they agree on the 3 joint communiques. But where they differ is that the United States also has the Taiwan Relations Act and the 6 assurances. And the United States has never agreed with Beijing's position that Taiwan is part of China. So that is a part of the PRC position that the United States does not agree with. And that's the distinction between Beijing's One China principle and the United States One China policy. Are there any questions up until this point? Because I just ran through quite a lot of information about does not agree that direct assurance. There's quite a lot packed in here. So if there's any questions, please let me know. Okay, because now we're going to be taking a yes, please.
Is there a uniform US policy? I mean, there may be different agendas on the part of, say, the Biden administration versus Congress or different parts of Congress. So do we really have a unified US policy?
It's unified in the executive branch. So for example, these contact guidelines are binding on executive branch officials, but they're not binding on Congress. And in the past, Beijing has more or less observed the distinction where executive branch actions have been interpreted with greater seriousness than congressional actions, congressional statements. So, for example, Congress has called Taiwan a nation in the Taipei Act. That wasn't seen as being as much of a shift on sovereignty as, say, Anthony Blinken calling Taiwan a country in verbal remarks. So there's a unified executive branch policy, and it's basically this position. Congress varies in how closely it adheres to this position, but it's not bound to follow the United States foreign China policy. Members of Congress have been very outspoken in their support for Taiwan in recent years in ways that aren't consistent with One China policy, but they don't need to be. So how did we get here? It's a very, oh, please.
I'm sorry, the statements that President Biden made about Taiwan's independence, I know there's a couple of times he talked about strategic ambiguity, and that got walked back immediately by some of his aides. Yeah. Have these statements been walked back similarly or no?
You mean in the history of U.S.-Taiwan relations?
For the recent statements President Biden made about Taiwan being independent, have there been any rumblings within the administration saying like, oh no, this is an official policy, like for how it has been for statements about strategic ambiguity and like whether the United States will defend Taiwan?
Usually when there's some kind of a statement like that becomes controversial, the US will say our policy has not changed. We still have a one China policy. And they don't spell out necessarily how you can reconcile the president's statements with a one China policy. But basically, if somebody in the administration slips and calls Taiwan a country or calls Taiwan independent, the United States will not correct that very specifically because it's seen as pouring cold water on Taiwan and say we don't call Taiwan a country. So the US will simply say our policy has not changed.
Didn't Biden 4 months ago say that the US would defend China, full stop? I'm sorry, Taiwan, excuse me.
So that's where it gets confusing. And so people call this strategic confusion. So I have spent many hours in my office in Taiwan trying to figure out what on earth is happening in US policy. And so my best interpretation of the situation is the administration has consistently resisted pressure from Congress to put this kind of declaration guaranteeing intervention in writing in legislation. And just a few days before President Biden made that statement, a new version of the Taiwan Policy Act was introduced that removed the guarantee of US support. So what that tells me is the US is still ambiguous at a formal level of written policy, but verbally the US is guaranteeing support to deter China. Because the fear is that if the US guarantees support for Taiwan no matter what, then Taiwan might then move in the direction of independence. So with a verbal statement, the US can promise now and walk it back later. And Taiwanese officials know this because President Bush said in 2001, the United States will do whatever it takes to defend Taiwan. And then Taiwan moved in a more pro-independence direction, and then the US walked that back, and then tensions rose between the US and Taiwan. So right now we have a situation where the US has a policy of formal ambiguity and verbal clarity. Some people, I kind of proposed it among my colleagues, and they said maybe you can call it ambiclarity. I don't think people just call it confusion, but with my best knowledge, that's the current thinking in the administration. But the official position is our policy has not changed, even though the president has gone on TV saying things that are not really written down in the official policy. So how do we get to this point? And this history is subject to a great deal of contention, not only between the US and China, and not only between Taiwan and China, but also different parties in Taiwan. So I'll say this as neutrally and objectively as possible. In 1895, the Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty of China, ceded Taiwan and Penghu, referred to collectively as Taiwan, to Japan. In 1911, the Qing dynasty was overthrown, and the Republic of China was founded in 1912. In 1943, the Cairo Declaration stated that Taiwan, quote, shall be restored to the Republic of China. It doesn't say China, it says Republic of China. And the Potsdam Declaration affirmed that the terms of the Cairo Declaration would be carried out. And ROC forces took control of Taiwan after the defeat of Japan. Effectively, this is what happened. The various sides disagree on how to interpret this. In 1949, the People's Republic of China was founded in the mainland, and the government of the Republic of China, the ROC, retreated to Taiwan. And during the Cold War, both governments denied the legitimacy of the other. These were two rival Chinese governments for many years. So they both maintained that Taiwan was part of China, and this is the one China principle. For the first half of the Cold War, the United States recognized the ROC as the sole legal government of China, but it maintained that the sovereignty of Taiwan was undetermined. In the San Francisco Peace Treaty and the Treaty of Taipei, Japan surrendered its sovereignty over Taiwan, but did not explicitly transfer sovereignty to China. In 1971, the United States began pursuing rapprochement with the PRC, trying to coordinate with Beijing against the Soviet Union. And that led to the normalization of relations in 1979. And because at that time, both the PRC and the ROC wanted to maintain the one China principle, the United States provided assurances to both sides that it would not adopt the two China's policy by recognizing Taiwan, the ROC, the second China, or recognizing Taiwan's independence. But the US executive branch wanted to avoid accusations from Congress that it was selling out Taiwan. And so as the US is, the various administrations are pivoting between Taipei, Beijing, and Congress, the result was the United States one China policy. And when Washington and Beijing started this process of pursuing rapprochement in 1971, there were two main issues of contention. First was sovereignty. The United States maintained that Taiwan's sovereignty was undetermined, while the PRC maintained that Taiwan was under the sovereignty of China. Security. The United States had a formal alliance with the ROC, and U.S. troops had been stationed in Taiwan, while Beijing maintained a threat of force and coercion against Taiwan. And those were the two main issues of contention between Washington and Beijing at the beginning of this process. And they issued statements to express their threats and assurances to each other. In the Shanghai Communique, Beijing asserted its position on Taiwan's sovereignty, saying it's part of China, and used very aggressive language, referring to the liberation of Taiwan. In Beijing's political terminology, liberation is a political outcome that Beijing claims the right to be able to use military force to achieve. So using the phrase liberation of Taiwan was very oppressive. So that was an absolute threat against Taiwan. So Beijing issued that statement in the Shanghai Communique. And Beijing's statement is very clear, it's very blunt. The US statement is subject to much more ambiguity. So the United States acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is part of China. So the United States says it acknowledges that position, which means it understands but does not necessarily agree with that position. And its interpretation of the status quo is simply that it understands that the two Chinese governments maintain this position. The United States hasn't agreed with that position. But it says the United States does not challenge that position. So that's the unconditional assurance, saying the US will not challenge Beijing on Taiwan's sovereignty. But it also says the United States reaffirms its interest in a peaceful settlement of the Taiwan question by the Chinese themselves. Chinese referring to the ROC and PRC governments. So when the US says it reaffirms its interest in peaceful settlement, that means the United States expects this dispute to be resolved peacefully. And if it's not resolved peacefully, the United States exercises a threat of intervention to prevent Beijing from using force or coercion against Taiwan. And then the last sentence says, in the meantime, it will progressively reduce its forces and military installations on Taiwan as the tension in the area diminishes. That means the US assurance that it will withdraw its forces from Taiwan is conditional on Beijing's commitment to a peaceful resolution of the dispute with Taiwan. And for the 1970s, the US more or less thought Beijing held up its end of the bargain. And so US forces gradually withdrew from Taiwan, and the US eventually abrogated its mutual defense treaty with Taiwan. Some of this was repeated in the normalization communique. This is the first reference to the United States having unofficial relations with the people of Taiwan. And then there's another statement on sovereignty. But again, it says the government of the United States of America acknowledges, which means understands, but does not necessarily agree with the Chinese position that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China. So the US only says we understand that this is the Chinese position, but the US does not say that it agrees with that position. But a dispute arose over the Chinese translation of the communique. And this is still really important for contemporary policy. So this term acknowledges in English in this sentence means understands, but does not necessarily agree with. The English version only says acknowledges. The Chinese version says 承认, which means recognizes. US officials noticed there was a discrepancy, but according to one author, one historian said that an argument ensued and dictionaries were consulted. How do you translate acknowledges into Chinese? And the US officials looked at the dictionary and they saw that one possible way of translating acknowledges was 承认. But that was what the dictionary said. The dictionary wasn't precise enough to say that acknowledges only means 承认 in a sentence construction in which acknowledges is followed by an indirect statement as a subordinate clause. It didn't say that in this sentence, acknowledges is followed by a noun, which is the Chinese position. So there was a very linguistic detail that US officials weren't aware of. And so what Chinese officials were saying, dictionary says that acknowledges is 承认. Eventually the US relented and allowed that translation to enter the Chinese version of the communique. And that's part of the reason why right now there are different interpretations of the status quo on sovereignty. So if you ask the question, did the United States recognize Taiwan as part of China in this communique? The answer is no in English, yes in Chinese. And so for the US position is that the US only ever negotiated this communique in English. The US never expressed itself in Chinese, and so the US does not consider that to be a binding on the United States. But China then points to the Chinese version of the communique, and then uses that to claim that the US made this commitment in 1979. The US is still bound by that commitment. For the US, there was never any commitment to recognize China's position on Taiwan sovereignty. The United States, in the lead up to the normalization communique, said that it would agree to the abrogation of the Mutual Defense Treaty, but President Carter also stated the following, that we will continue to have an interest in the peaceful resolution of the Taiwan issue. And he said that he had talked to China and that there were safeguards for Taiwan security, but for Congress, this wasn't good enough. The Taiwan Relations Act was originally a bill to put unofficial relations in practice, such as by establishing AIT. But Congress used that as an opportunity to define a much more assertive policy on Taiwan security than what had previously been negotiated in the normalization communique. And there were numerous security provisions that expressed the United States threats and assurances. And for our purposes, the most important part is that in the Taiwan Relations Act, it said that other than peaceful means, including by boycotts or embargoes. So the definition of peaceful in the Taiwan Relations Act is the absence of force and coercion, any threat to this to the security or the social or economic system of the people on Taiwan. It's a very broad definition of peaceful. And the United States maintains the capacity to resist any resort to non-peaceful means. So there's a conditional threat to become directly involved in the defense of Taiwan. And then, because this Taiwan Relations Act also referred to U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, the Chinese government protested, and a third joint communique was issued in 1982. And Beijing also again asserted its position on Taiwan sovereignty. And then it dropped the language of liberation that we saw in the Shanghai communique, and then said that it would strive for peaceful reunification. But there are two things to note about that. First, striving means that China will do its best, but no promises. And peaceful means absence of force, not necessarily coercion. So there's left a lot of room for China to adopt aggressive measures against Taiwan. And the arms sales communique also expressed the United States' non-support for Taiwan's independence and provided its absolute assurance that the United States would not support the two China's policy or one China, one Taiwan. But the United States never said Taiwan was a matter of China's internal affairs, and the United States did not say that it opposed Taiwan's independence. The US doesn't have a position on the substance of sovereignty as a position on the process of determining sovereignty. And this statement has been controversial because China has frequently accused the United States of not living up to the arms sales communique, because it says that the United States does not seek to carry out a long-term policy of arms sales to Taiwan, that its arms sales to Taiwan will not exceed the level of those supplied in recent years, and it intends gradually to reduce its arms sales to Taiwan. And so China sees the continuing arms sales and says that the US violated this communique. But this was actually a conditional assurance. It seems absolute, but it was actually a conditional assurance. And this wasn't publicly known until relatively recently. During the Trump administration, the US declassified an internal document explaining what Reagan really meant when the communique was issued. And it said, in short, the US willingness to reduce its arms sales to Taiwan is conditioned absolutely upon the continued commitment of China to the peaceful solution of the Taiwan PRC differences. So it meant that arms sales were conditional. And so that means that this communique didn't resolve anything. Because China maintains a threat against Taiwan, the US still sells arms to Taiwan. Because the US still sells arms to Taiwan, China still maintains a threat against Taiwan. And so this communique didn't really make either side kind of back down on either of their positions. And because the language of that communique seemed to be leaning pretty strongly in Beijing's direction, The US also issued the Six Assurances to Taipei in 1982, for saying that, for example, the United States had not agreed to set a date for any arms sales to Taiwan. And importantly for our purposes is that the US said it has not altered its position regarding sovereignty over Taiwan. So this is the US explaining its interpretation of the status quo. The US does not recognize Taiwan as part of China. So to kind of reiterate like what we discussed before in terms of the three key terms. In the Shanghai Communique and the Arms Sales Communique, the United States said that it did not challenge China's position on sovereignty over Taiwan and that it did not support Taiwan's independence. But the United States also did not accept China's position on sovereignty over Taiwan, and it remained opposed to the use of force or coercion in Taiwan Strait. And then with the rise of Taiwanese nationalism after democratization, the US came to express its position as opposition to unilateral changes in the quote status quo. So George Bush said in 2003, we oppose any unilateral decision by either China or Taiwan to change the status quo. President Biden recently reaffirmed this in his speech to the United Nations, in which he said, and we continue to oppose unilateral changes to the status quo by either side. But it's not clear what the US means by status quo. Harvey Feldman, a former US diplomat, wrote in 2007 that although these administration spokespersons often add the words as we define it, status quo as we define it, they do not in fact define them. So what does this term mean? It doesn't mean nothing changes, because clearly they're positively changing for the last 50 years. But there's some abstract condition that the US wants to preserve without actually saying what the conditions are. It is clear, however, that the US and the PRC have fundamentally different interpretations of the status quo as it pertains to the sovereignty of Taiwan. For the United States, Taiwan's sovereignty has never been determined since the end of World War II. For the PRC, Taiwan is under the sovereignty of China. And because the two sides have disagree on what sovereignty means, they then disagree on what unofficial relations between the US and Taiwan means. Because for China, they see Taiwan as part of China, and then they see US officials visiting Taiwan as encroachment on their sovereignty. But for the United States, the US doesn't recognize Taiwan under Chinese sovereignty. Taiwan's sovereignty is undetermined. So there's much wider latitude for the United States to interact and to cooperate with Taiwan. So to kind of repeat, so to summarize what I said before, there's no agreement between Washington and Beijing on what these three key terms actually mean. For peaceful, for Washington, peace is the absence of force and coercion. For Beijing, peace is the absence of force, not necessarily coercion. The US has never defined the term unofficial relations, and the US has never defined all the features of the status quo at a conceptual level. And Beijing considers the one China principle to be part of the status quo, which the United States does not agree with. So these three terms encode all the threats and assurances, but they're written at a very abstract level. What they actually mean has never been defined. So in conclusion, looking at contemporary policy, as Beijing has been raising its threat against Taiwan, and the US has been deepening cooperation with Taiwan, Washington and Beijing have been competing fiercely over the international narrative of who is status quo and who is revisionist. They've made this argument before the United Nations and in their official statements. So who is status quo? Who's revisionist? Is it China trying to change the status quo and unify with Taiwan through force or coercion? Or is it the United States pushing Taiwan in the direction of independence? They've been competing over this narrative. And I don't think it's going to be possible for the US and China to ever reach an agreement on what these terms mean in a way that safeguards the dignity and the autonomy of Taiwan. But US strategy depends critically right now on what allies and partners think about this. If there's ever a conflict in the Taiwan Strait, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia will all be critical for the defense of Taiwan. But whether or not those countries are willing to support the United States in the Taiwan Strait, I think will depend critically on whether they think the US is fighting for the rules-based international order, preserving the status quo and against a revisionist authoritarian power. And they're much less likely to support the United States if they think that the US is poking China in the eye and provoking the conflict. So whether or not they will support the United States depends on whether or not they agree with how the United States defines peaceful, unofficial, and status quo at a theoretical and a practical level. So I think that there is, even though the US is often very resistant to defining these terms very clearly, with its allies at least, I think that there should be some kind of joint definition, because as the United States and its allies have said, peace in the Taiwan Strait is not a matter of China's sovereignty. domestic sovereignty. It's a matter of international concern. So if the US is going to try to build a coalition with the Philippines, with Japan, with Australia, then the United States needs to have a coherent allied conception of what these key terms actually mean. And to kind of take a step back and look at all of the material that I presented, why focus so much on these communiques? One time I presented at a conference, and someone in DC who had experience in the military said that US policy is not defined by the lawyers in the State Department. So I've given you a very lawyerly, very legalistic way of looking at all these communiques. So why is it important to still study this? But there's a tendency in the United States right now to think of Taiwan security as a matter of tanks, guns, and missiles, and to focus on the military aspect of competition. But I think it's also really important to focus on these historical and legal aspects for one specific reason, which is that if the United States is going to try to make the case that its policies are status quo policies and it hasn't changed its historic policy, then it has to understand what the historic policies actually were. Read the Shanghai Communique, the Arms Sales Communique, the PRA, Counter Religious Act, the Secret Assurances, and understand what the US has and has not promised to China, and maintain that consistency with US policy. So that when the US said our policy toward Taiwan has not changed, we still have one China policy. People are going to hold that up against the standard of these historic declarations of policy to determine whether or not the US is living up to its word. So that's why I personally find this kind of lawyerly analysis to be valuable. Some may disagree, and if you do, no offense, I won't be offended by that, but I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
No. Can you please walk us through the national security interests of each of the perspective of the US on the one hand and then China on the other? I mean, there's got to be more than just from the US point of view, we want democracy. And from China's point of view, that is a matter of national pride. There must be a lot of national security interests that's driving this conflict.
So for China, I think primarily it's domestic nationalism, and it affects the perceived legitimacy of the sea property, China's domestic politics. A secondary concern would be China's desire to project power into Indo-Pacific. China has stated a goal of becoming a world-class military power by 2049 and wants to break through the first island chain. And then I would say probably the third factor is Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing capacity. It's been estimated that if China were to take control of Taiwan, it would control about, I think, 80% of the world's capacity for manufacturing computer chips. So that would give China the slight advantage over the United States in the geoeconomic competition. For the United States, there's also a domestic aspect to it, but for the United States, historically, U.S. interest has been defined in terms of the first island chain. And recently, there's been a lot more attention paid to Taiwan's semiconductor. And I would say that if you look at the history of U.S. strategy and look at where the United States defined its vital interest in the past, then Taiwan now falls under the category of vital interest, because George Kennan's, in defining the strong defense strategy of the Cold War, said that the United States cannot allow an adversary to control the global centers of industrial power that will allow that adversary to pose a threat to the continent of the United States. Now, given how important these computer chips are, I think that means Taiwan is now at the same level of importance as Japan and Germany.
Yeah, sorry, and here, it's in the name.
Right. Thank you, James. Really good presentation. So I have a question about the interpretation of, say, independence. So it defines a lot of terms, say, like status quo and unofficial, but I think one of the key part of this whole crisis or whole condition is about the act of declaring independence. But so far, I think in the previous government, there's no such issues. But right now, I'm Taiwanese, so our president candidate, one of them say that Taiwan doesn't have to declare independence because it is already independent. Does that count as some kind of declaration of independence that violates the status quo, or does that count as nothing? So I think this kind of declaration creates some kind of based on between the US and China. How do you assess this kind of conflicting interpretation?
So the United States policy is to oppose unilateral changes to the status quo. The United States does not oppose unilateral interpretations of what the status quo is. So when the DPP says Taiwan is already a sovereign and independent state called the Republic of China, Taiwan, the U.S. you'll notice never says we disagree with this. The U.S. doesn't challenge that, doesn't agree, doesn't challenge that. It's a unilateral interpretation by Taiwan of what the status quo is. And where China calls Taiwan a part of China, the U.S. also doesn't directly challenge that. So the U.S. is being fair by not challenging Taiwan's unilateral interpretation. Where the United States does effectively draw a line is calling calling itself Republic of Taiwan. But saying Taiwan is already an independent sovereign state called the Republic of China, Taiwan, is not something the U.S. is necessarily opposed to. And there's another kind of detail to that, which is the United States, after it broke diplomatic relations with the ROC, never said the ROC no longer exists. The U.S. Said that referred to the governing authorities previously recognized as the Republic of China. So the U.S. does not recognize the ROC, but does not deny the existence of the ROC either. So as long as Taiwanese leaders can connect their assertion of sovereignty to the ROC, for the U.S. that wouldn't be a change in the status quo.
What does the citizens of Taiwan, what do they?
The public opinion data that have shown pretty consistently that most Taiwanese citizens favor the status quo. Question is what is but the survey evidence is indicate that's what people want.
So I actually never realized that part of the Shanghai Communique was mentioned the ultimate withdrawal of all U.S. forces and bases from Taiwan. Do you interpret that as a conditional or unconditional promise on the part of the U.S.? Because of course, right now, I mean, I just read the Washington Post, it says there are more military advisors from the U.S. into Taiwan. Do you see that as kind of a violation of the Shanghai Communique, or it is consistent because it is still, it is a conditional promise of the United States? And then the other question very quickly is, what is the role of the 92 consensus in your framework?
Thank you. So the United States said in the Shanghai Communique, as the tension in the area diminishes, so tensions have gone up. So I don't think it's a violation of the U.S. the U.S. assurance to reintroduce forces. And it also says in the Taiwan Relations Act, this gets really geeky. In furtherance of the policy set forth in Section 2 of this Act, the United States will make available to Taiwan defense articles and defense services as may be necessary to enable Taiwan to maintain sufficient self-defense capability. So, what I mean is the advisors fall into the category of defense services. They are not permanent U.S. forces stationed in Taiwan. That's a key difference. So this is all permitted under the Taiwan Relations Act. And closest
92 consensus.
92 consensus. So that is another. So when I said that Taiwanese disagree on what the status quo is, that's the issue. So Taiwan's politics is moderated in that in the past there was unification or independence, and now it's converged for the debate about. In the mainstream, it's converged for a debate about what the status quo is. And the 92 consensus is an interpretation of the status quo, and the rejection of the 92 consensus is also an interpretation of the status quo.
Yeah, you saw so many one over here and then, yeah.
So, could you go back to the first slide? And by the way, James, of course, we're so proud of you, not just as a postdoc here, but from your undergraduate degree at UCSD. When I last taught, the quote to my, yes, this one. I found this very striking. Will only result in the permanent loss of Taiwan. That's parallel, of course, to the Truman era rhetoric about the loss of China. In other words, the US controlled China and we lost it to the communists. Now we're risking losing Taiwan to China. I mean, this is a pretty repugnant kind of rhetoric, at least from the standpoint of somebody concerned about US imperialism, to frame this issue in terms of, are we going to lose Taiwan because of change in policy?
It's a reference to creating the perception that China will lose Taiwan. So what they're referring to is the possibility that Taiwan, even if it doesn't become legally independent, will be permanently separated from China. And they want to avoid creating that perception in Beijing.
They would lose it to our possession. In other words, China wouldn't possess it. They would lose it to the United States.
And not necessarily, the concern about China having that perception is about Taiwan simply not being part of China for the long term, a kind of permanent condition. It doesn't necessarily mean the alternative is being part of the US sphere of influence.
Yeah.
This is a question from Barry Naughton online. So he says, it's clever for China to translate acknowledge into China because it makes it seem like the US has agreed to more of the Chinese position, but the whole sentence includes the clear assertion that this is the Chinese position. And if somebody, in this case the US, actually accepted a given position, they would never phrase it this way as the Chinese position, as they would just accept the position. So the Chinese interpretation, in his view, doesn't really make sense. Is that line of reasoning flawed in the sort of lawyerly view of this text, or is it basically okay?
So logically, would it have made sense for the US to say it recognizes China's position?
Yes. It's just like it recognizes the position that China is that, that Chinese on both sides of the strait agree that yada, yada, yada.
I'm not sure if I can say one way or the other.
Yeah, in the interest of time, we can only allow two more questions. One more at the back and then one more here.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for the talk. It was really great. This recommendation that at least the United States should clarify its position on what status quo means with its allies. It's really interesting. So, kind of two parts to this question. First, what are the barriers? I mean, obviously, it's really hard to clarify this position with the Chinese because we've come to two different interpretations of the same thing. But with ourselves and with our allies, I mean, why aren't we able to do that? And second, if we are able to, so what? I mean, what really does it mean to do the lawyer kind of interpretation work if what's really at play here is we fundamentally don't agree. We're just not agreeing to say out loud that we don't agree. And actually, it's about missiles and boats and who is going to be able to actually control this missile plan.
But who is willing to deploy those missiles and boats in Taiwan defense? And whether or not, say, the Philippines has recently been carrying out joint exercises with the United States, rehearsing a potential Taiwan contingency. But whether or not the Philippines is willing to provide that kind of support in wartime is a different question. And so why does this matter? It matters because there could be people, and there probably are people in, say, the Philippines, who look at this and look at what President Marcos is doing and saying, the Philippines shouldn't get involved. Taiwan is a part of China. There are all these like communiques and things and UN resolutions saying this and saying that Taiwan is part of China. Why is the Philippines getting dragged into a conflict with China over Taiwan? And why should the Philippines let it be pushed by the United States in this regard? People might be saying that. So the lawyerly reasoning is that actually the United States has never recognized Taiwan as part of China. And every country has defined its position differently, but say Japan has a one China policy, not recognizing Taiwan as part of China. And so does South Korea. And so it's important to understand this, to have clarity about this among allies, even if there isn't like full definition of status quo, at least on this kind of key issue about the sovereignty of Taiwan, because China has been very aggressive about promoting its view of Taiwan sovereignty in, say, the United Nations, and trying to say UN Resolution 2758 says Taiwan is part of China. Doesn't say that. And so the United States needs to push back and say that this isn't about the United States prodding its allies to a conflict over China, involving itself in China's internal affairs. This is about a political entity that has been a free and democratic for the last 30 years. And it's not about violating another country solid. So that's kind of why I think the US needs to have at least some degree of joint understanding of these outcomes.
Last question.
Yeah, so I think I'm curious about this statement, and it sort of leads into why is China the impatient one, right? Isn't there a counter argument that their long-term macroeconomic conditions, rising power, and so on, that China can afford to wait until things continue the inevitable shift in its favor, at which point it can simply dictate terms in terms of the island, in terms of the United States. At the very least, its relationship to the United States in terms of power, in all likelihood, will be better in the future than it is today, it was in the past. So why is it the impatient one? And that kind of tension between the logic of impatience also follows through to the one China policy. Everybody could agree as long as they were all optimistic about different versions of the future. And the problem now is that they have more compatible visions about the future, that ultimately China is a growing threat to the autonomy of Taiwan.
So I would agree with the idea that China is impatient, and I think
Well, that's what this says, literally. Right?
I don't think so.
If fears in Beijing are increasing, they're waiting for a peaceful resolution. Well, it's afraid that waiting is not going to work out.
So that's kind of the general situation. I think I can summarize what these authors have written in other papers and their perspective on this, which is that there's no concrete evidence that China in and of itself is preparing for an imminent invasion of Taiwan, and that has a long-term kind of strategy for achieving military modernization and using the macroeconomic indicators pointing in that direction, as you indicated. But if the United States assumes the conflict is imminent and then starts taking a certain position on Taiwan sovereignty, for example, then that might lead China to use its military force now, even though it doesn't have any plan to do so. So China is using its military force as a deterrent and doesn't have a compelling strategy in the near future. Does that answer your question?
Sure.
Okay, I think time is up. Let's thank Dr. Yan. So we can carry on the conversation. Thank you very much.
Sarah's like,
How are you?
One guy on that, if they start off saying